So it's just like a decision-making tool, since everyone kind of has a different amount of resources to respond. Background, as most of you probably know, responding to an overdose has a risk of transmission for COVID. You can give and get it. Some people are aware that you can give and get it from giving breaths. You can also give and get it from doing chest compressions or just moving someone, depending on how they're breathing. So the kind of like background disclaimer is still varies on where you're looking, what resource you're looking at. The BCCDC safety warning is basic, which makes sense to me, is take precautions, but the risk of brain injury or death outweighs a risk of getting a disease. The VCH warning is things to consider before giving breaths. And this is kind of an important one for a community, I think, just because I've talked to a lot of people who are kind of like, well, I'll just use the face shield because it has a one-way valve. And one thing that I do find useful that is kind of a disclaimer through VCH is that the one-way valve is not safe protection necessarily. So if someone is like immunocompromised or at a higher risk and they think they can still use that and it will be totally preventative, it's not. So I just want people to know that. But basically their protocols kind of depend on where people are responding. So I'll just go through some of them to kind of show how much they vary. And I guess I'm showing this just because I think it's also obviously really upsetting that there are so many more precautions that can be taken. Like I work at some of the clinics. There's so many precautions that we can take because we have a lot of resources in PPE. So the fact that there's not a lot of work being done to make sure that people have resources to any of that is obviously a COVID transmission risk. And it's a problem. So just to show kind of like what the variation is. That's all this slide says. So for clinical staff at VCH, and I find that there's just kind of like rumors going around about what's the right and wrong kind of protocols and precautions. So I just like thought I can at least share what they're actually telling people. For clinical staff, like anywhere in VCH, even if we're on outreach in responding to an OD, we, like a nurse or a doctor, is not supposed to go anywhere near anyone's head even. They don't want us to be listening for breaths. They don't want us to even take someone's pulse in their neck. They just want us to take the pulse by the wrist. So it's basically like the opposite of how we used to respond to an OD. We're dealing with like an external defibrillator before dealing with breaths, which is an intense change. OPS is a little different, and also different resources. Obviously, there's not as much PPE. So at the clinics also, what the protocol has changed to is basically that they want everyone who needs to be responding to be gowning up completely with N95 masks and gowns while people are doing those preliminary things, and then moving someone into a room where it's possible to respond in the ways that we normally do, at least to put in an airway and give someone a bag valve. But as probably all of you have seen, usually the first thing that you do is put it in an airway and give someone a bag valve if you have if you have an ambu bag. I guess the other background disclaimer that I should give is that's another thing that aerosolizes all of the particles. And sorry if this is stuff you already know. Aside from compressions or giving breath through the mask, a bag valve is definitely aerosolizing. So that is something that people are definitely waiting to do longer than normal, whether it's like paramedics, nurses, or anyone who's clinical who's able to respond. That pressure and forcing that much oxygen can release a bunch of the particles into the air, and they stay in the air supposedly for an hour. So clinically, they're asking people, if you respond and someone needs to be bagged, I work at Insight too, and this is what we're doing there. Everyone has to be evacuated from the room because they will be exposed if there's a bag valve being used. And then the room has to stay clear for 1 hour, and then we have to clean it. So that's kind of like, just to give an example of like, with a lot of equipment and the ability to do a lot of precautions, that's the safest kind of OD response that for the people who are responding, without like seriously compromising the people you're responding for. OPSs are a little more vague because there's obviously really varied access to resources, and some of them have more. But they're kind of saying it more depends on what you have, and you can give breaths if you choose to use the face shield. That's basically their recommendation, and use whatever PPE you have, a gown. In community, I would say, like, and this is what I'm doing at work anyway, is like, just changing clothes is like a great thing to do. And it's fine if you don't have a gown, just change clothes. First Nations Health Authority, this might have changed since I made this, but the protocol was just to use a face shield and whatever other protective measures you have. BCCDC is like pretty much at your discretion. Use a face shield and nasal prongs if you have. So I guess the fact that they put this in the protocol is a bit helpful though, because it is worth mentioning that even with all those precautions, the first thing that we are allowed to do, even with everything, it's really weird. Basically right now they're like, here's all the things you normally use. You can't use any of them in the normal way. We can use a simple face mask, just like a regular, the plastic that's shaped like this and has like the green band and you pull it over. We can still give oxygen to someone up to 10 liters, and that amount of pressure with a regular face mask and a regular oxygen tank does not aerosolize particles enough for it to be contagious to people who are immediately around. So ideally you would still be wearing a higher particle mask, but if all you have is whatever mask, it shouldn't be aerosolizing as much as the other ways of giving oxygen. So for community, and I have this in a later slide, I just think, like, thinking down the line in harm reduction, I feel like asking for oxygen tanks and face masks is probably the most harm reductive option if we're going to try to plan like for the fall and for the future. It's low risk on either end. And I know some buildings have actually been taking away oxygen tanks that they used to have to respond. So I do feel like it's kind of like, it might be an important time to push for that if it's possible. This is just comparing the breathing, which is what the difference is between all of these protocols, and kind of like less important if you only have one option anyway. So just kind of like the takeaway from this, and reason why I'm hoping to compare all these things, is just obviously I'll always give Narcan. That's still the same. I'm sure you all know that there are more complex ODs and way more benzo ODs. So generally we're giving a double dose off the bat in community. And that's a completely safe thing for anyone to do still. The kind of like point and the reason that I'm trying to have these conversations is just that talking with a lot of people, I found that it just wasn't really being talked about, the ability to have these conversations and plan a little bit more for OD response than we're used to doing. Just because if there's some people in buildings who do a lot of OD response, but they're really immunocompromised, I think what we can do, especially in summer when, you know, things are looking pretty good right now and there's not tons of positive cases in the downtown east side, it's kind of a time that we can use to plan for what the safest ways for everyone to respond is. So let's say there's someone who, has really bad COPD and a heart condition, and they do a lot of OD response in their building normally. If there's someone else in the building who can also respond, but, you know, feels more comfortable normally doing chest compressions or something, if they can do breaths, and that could be the plan, that would be just like a harm reductive approach already. And none of it's ideal because obviously we want everyone to be able to do what they're doing safely. But if people are gonna be in situations where they're giving breaths and using a face mask, then I worry about people who are already really compromised having to do that without even being aware of the risks, and being able to plan around it. So overall, I'm like advocate for everyone to have more equipment and be safer. But also I think it's good for you guys to know so that you can have these conversations with people, just because it's hard for, I think, everyone to be thinking about ODs in a different way. It's something that we're all probably pretty used to doing, and it's the same every time, and it becomes a bit ingrained. And that shouldn't change in this way. Like, obviously, a risk of brain damage and death is the most important thing to respond to. But if we have time to plan ahead in kind of a bigger scale for people that are responding in buildings, then it would be really safe for people to communicate about it, so that anyone who is compromised can put themselves in a safer position. So they're the one administering Narcan, or if we get more supplies, they're the one who gets an N95 that they can use when they're responding. Just so we know who needs what. These next slides are just an elaboration of that. Just saying that, resource allotment and who gets what is definitely messed up. And at the same time, what makes any response safer, regardless of who's doing it, is communication beforehand and like practicing these scenarios. And that can be really hard to do, but like I've seen people who are medical completely flub OD response because they don't actually know what they're doing. And like, as we know, most people in community know how to respond really, really fast. So I think it's just kind of, I wanted to kind of provide information so that people can just check in and talk to each other in terms of planning, just because it is something that we can not just have in the back of our minds for people, but like planning these things and communicating and practicing running through them could be really, really harm reductive in the long run. If in the fall the pandemic gets worse or hits the downtown east side a lot harder than it has, then people can be a little bit prepared about how to work as teams in buildings. These slides are intended for organizations that have more rules. So they're just about how no one can tell you to give breaths, which is true for people who really don't feel safe doing that. And these are just some scenarios that I included if teams want to go through how to kind of work out who does what. Sometimes, especially when we're really used to doing things in a certain order in emergency situations like this, and then the order changes, that can be unsafe just because we take a lot more time to figure out what's going on. So that's kind of the practice part, and it's been okay recently, but it's kind of a good time to prepare for the fall, which could change how the pandemic is going, obviously. Yeah, so these are just scenarios you can use. I sent Eris a poster that I can send out again, but these are just suggestions about kind of like how to have a simple check-in, and you all know how these are applicable to who you're talking about. I'm not exactly sure how it would work necessarily in individual SROs, but if there are a couple people who regularly respond to ODs, then the point of this is basically that it would be a good idea for those people to be in touch and just identify who feels safe doing what, or ultimately people are probably going to just respond if they know that they know how to do that because it's an emergency. But if someone feels less safe and is immunocompromised or is older, then to kind of have a team where you know who's going to do what, make things go a lot more smoothly. And it's a good time to practice that. If you don't want to give breaths, that's okay. Yeah, and just to reiterate, that is the safest option for the person who's giving breaths. But in order to have an emergency response, then that means we have to plan ahead. It's good to physically run through how you'd respond and to debrief. Yeah, and if you do give breaths or CPR, I mean, anyone who's involved in any way, basically, then monitor yourself really closely for symptoms. The symptom list has expanded. So if you have talked to people who are trying to go to 611 and get testing, and they have said, oh, you can't get tested because you don't have a fever, it's not true. You can have basically any of these symptoms and be eligible for a COVID test. And that should hopefully stay the same while they have capacity. And that's the testing center, as you probably all know. Yeah, so as I said before, the something that we can do that I think is very possible to do in the SROs is to try to have more oxygen tanks around, because they can run at 10 liters and still be safe. And I'm not sure how we can do that, but might be time. Yeah, team communication. And debriefing sounds cheesy, but it's the same thing. Whenever anything changes, it's how we're going to get used to doing things differently. It's just encouraging people to do that. That's it. Is everyone muted?
I'm unmuted.
There we go. Thank you so much for presenting that. I appreciate it. Does anybody